In the spring of 1865, a paroled cavalryman from Georgia rode west along a rutted road with a brass-framed revolver tucked inside his coat, the only object of any value he still owned after 4 years of war. His horse was his own, under the terms of the surrender. His revolver was his own, for the same reason. His farm, when he reached it, was not. That gun made the same ride tens of thousands of times that year, in tens of thousands of coats, because Grant's terms at Appomattox let officers keep their sidearms instead of stacking them with the rest. Number 7 on this list could kill a man at 1,000 yards, in an age when most infantry could not hit a barn at 200. Number 1 hung above more Southern fireplaces than any other gun ever made. 25 of them, cataloged here from the ordinary to the impossible. Number 25, the Palmetto Armory Pistol. In Columbia, South Carolina, a few years before Fort Sumter, a gunsmith named William Glaze held a state contract to arm the militia of South Carolina, and the result was a single-shot .54 caliber horse pistol copied, almost stroke for stroke, from the United States model 1842. It was not an original design. It did not need to be. South Carolina wanted guns that worked, and Glaze's Palmetto Armory delivered them stamped with a palmetto tree where the Federal eagle had been, a small act of substitution that within the decade would look almost prophetic. By the spring of 1861, the pistol was already old stock, carried into the earliest fighting by officers and mounted men who had drawn it from state arsenals before the Confederacy had a uniform code, a flag of its own design, or a national armory to call its own. Survivors carried it home the same way they had carried it out 4 years earlier. In a saddlebag, half forgotten, one of the very first weapons the South had made for itself, from a government that still believed the war would be short. Few palmetto pistols survived the century that followed with their original markings intact. An authentic example today brings several $1,000s at auction, not for its performance. It was already a generation behind the day it was forged, but for what it represents, the opening motion of a government arming itself before it had officially decided it needed to. Number 24, the Tucker, Sherard, and Company revolver. At Lancaster, Texas, a small partnership set out to build a .44 caliber copy of the Colt Dragoon, the heaviest revolver the U.S. Army had ever issued, at a moment when Texas had almost no machine tools capable of the work. But the operation never had the capacity its ambitions required. Parts arrived late. Skilled labor was scarce. And what little the shop could produce came in trickles measured in single digits, rather than hundreds. Only a few dozen were ever finished before the enterprise collapsed under its own shortages, a common Confederate story told in miniature, a good design, a real contract, and not enough of anything else to see it through. A Confederate cavalryman who rode home from the surrender with a Tucker, Sherard revolver in his saddlebag, was carrying one of the scarcest handguns in the country, scarcer, in raw numbers, than nearly anything the more established Southern armories turned out in Georgia or Virginia. He likely had no idea. The gun asked for a Colt Dragoon's weight and power in a Confederacy that could not supply a Colt Dragoon's tooling. Collectors today do not so much price a genuine Tucker, Sherard, as bid for one. Verified examples have brought tens of thousands of dollars, less for what the gun could do than for how few of them exist to prove it was ever made at all. Number 23, the Dance Brothers revolver. In Columbia, Texas, J.H. Dance and his brothers built a percussion revolver in .44 and .36 caliber that any Colt-trained eye would recognize and immediately flag as different. No recoil shield, a flat frame milled down to save material and machine time the Confederacy's westernmost armory did not have to spare. It was not an elegant compromise. It was a practical one. Built for cavalrymen who needed a working revolver more than they needed a handsome one, The highest known serial number on a surviving dance revolver sits only in the low 300s, not 3,000. 300, which means the entire output of the firm, across the whole of the war, could have been issued to a single understrength regiment. West of the Mississippi, that scarcity mattered more than it did anywhere else in the Confederacy. There was no direct shipping lane to Georgia's foundries, no blockade runner idling off a Gulf port to bring in an English Kerr or Adams. Trans-Mississippi Confederates fought with what Texas could build, and Texas built the dance. Soldiers who rode home to ranches across that stretch of Texas carried, in effect, the only revolver their part of the war had ever offered them. It became, in the decades after, precisely what a rare thing becomes in a family. Not a curiosity, but an heirloom, handed down the way land was handed down because there had only ever been one to give. Number 22, the Columbus Firearms Revolver. A private manufacturer in Columbus, Georgia, set out to build a .36 caliber revolver in the Navy pattern, the standard sidearm silhouette of the war, and failed often enough at it that the Confederate government eventually stepped in and took the operation over outright. That single fact says more about Southern industry than any production number could. A national government, fighting for its survival, found it necessary to nationalize a pistol factory because private enterprise alone could not deliver. Fewer than 100 Columbus revolvers were ever completed across the entire life of the operation, under both private and government management combined. A revolver of this pattern that survived the war, and the century and a half since, is close to a one-of-a-kind object, a serial number without a matching set anywhere else in a private collection or a museum case. The gun itself was unremarkable to look at, a Navy pattern .36 like 100 others produced across the South. What makes it worth counting is what it stands for. The whole of the Confederacy's struggle to build a precision sidearm, reamed bores, fitted cylinders, hand-tuned actions. Without the machine shops, the skilled tool and die men, or the interchangeable parts factories the North had spent a generation building in Hartford and Springfield. A soldier who carried one home carried a nearly impossible object, a gun that should not, by the South's own resources, have existed at all. Number 21, the Spiller and Burr revolver. A partnership under contract to the Confederate government, working first in Atlanta and then in Macon, Georgia, built a copy of the Whitney revolver in .36 caliber, and made one substitution that changed everything about the gun without changing anything about how it fired. The frame was cast in brass instead of iron. It was not a matter of style or tradition or the honey-colored shine that made the finished revolver look in some lights almost decorative. It was a matter of arithmetic. The South needed its iron for cannon. The South needed its steel for ironclads. The South needed what little machinery it had for railroads that were falling apart faster than they could be repaired. A revolver frame was one of the few places the ledger could bend, and so it bent toward brass. Roughly 1,450 were produced before the war ended. The operation moved from Atlanta to Macon, as Sherman's armies made the first city an increasingly dangerous place to run a government arsenal. Confederate cavalrymen carried them home to Georgia and Alabama, sometimes only months after the guns had left the factory floor. There is a final, almost accidental irony in the brass. Steel rusts, brass tarnishes, and then it simply sits. A century and a half later, the soft, cheap, improvised frames of the Spiller and Burr have often survived in better condition than the hardened steel frames of the Northern guns they were built to imitate. A metal chosen out of desperation, outlasting the metal chosen out of plenty. Number 20, the Lamat revolver. Here is where the story turns strange. Not a modification of an existing gun, not a copy of a Yankee pattern, a genuine hybrid, a 9-shot .42 caliber revolver built around a second, wider barrel beneath the cylinder, a barrel that fired a single load of buckshot at the flick of the hammer's nose. 9 pistol shots. Then If the fight came apart at arm's length, one blast of shot that could clear a doorway, or a knot of men crowding a saddle. No other sidearm of the war offered that. Dr. Jean-Alexandre Lamat had designed it in New Orleans before the war, and found in the Confederacy a customer with an appetite for anything that multiplied a single soldier's firepower. Production moved to France and Belgium once the blockade tightened around southern ports, and the guns came back across the Atlantic in the holds of blockade runners. A French design serving a Confederate order of battle. Only around 2,900 were ever finished. Two names carried it into legend. J.E.B. Stuart wore one through the cavalry raids that made his reputation, and P.G.T. Beauregard, the general who had opened the war at Fort Sumter, carried one as well. It was an officer's gun, heavy and expensive, its price near $35 in 1862, more than 3 months' pay for the private who would never own one. Under Grant's terms, an officer's sidearm went home with him. The men who survived, Appomattox, with a Lamat still on their belt, rode out armed with the strangest gun of the war, the shotgun barrel unfired for months, the 9 chambers carrying whatever the last skirmish had left in them. A working Lamat today brings more than $20,000 at auction. The gun outlasted the country that ordered it built. Number 19, the Kerr revolver. By 1863, the London Armory Company was producing 5-shot .44 caliber revolvers by the thousand, and the Confederacy was buying nearly all of them it could get through the blockade. The Kerr was not glamorous. It was not the fastest gun on either side of the war. What it was rugged, simpler in its lockwork than the Colt, built to be stripped and repaired by a cavalry armorer, with a file and a vise instead of a factory bench. That simplicity was the point. A trooper camped in the field for weeks at a stretch, far from any arsenal, needed a gun that forgave neglect. The Kerr forgave it. Confederate purchasing agents in England, buying rifles and revolvers on credit against cotton that had not yet run the blockade, ordered them by the crate alongside Enfield's, and the guns crossed the Atlantic in the same holds, at the same risk, with the same odds of capture before they ever touched southern sand. Cavalry regiments across the Confederacy carried them, prized less for elegance than for endurance. A Kerr that had survived 2 years of hard riding was worth more, in the spring of 1865, than the paper currency in a soldier's pocket, which by then bought almost nothing at all. Paroled troopers carried them home not as trophies, but as tools. A British-made revolver that had done its job and would keep doing it, hanging eventually over a mantle instead of a saddle horn. Number 18, the Adams revolver. Most revolvers of the Civil War required a soldier to thumb back the hammer before every shot, a single-action mechanism that demanded a free hand and a half-second no cavalryman fighting at arm's length could always spare. The Adams broke that rule. A double-action .44 caliber revolver. It fired with one long pull of the trigger, cocking and releasing the hammer in the same motion. In the scramble of a mounted melee, that half-second was the entire difference between the man who fired again and the man who did not. British-made, expensive, and imported in far smaller numbers than the workhorse Enfields and Kerrs, the Adams belonged almost exclusively to officers who could pay for it privately, men buying speed the way other men bought rank. No Ordnance Bureau issued it. Cavalry officers and staff men bought their own, one gun at a time, men who had seen what a revolver could and could not do at 3 feet, and wanted every advantage the London gun trade could sell them. Those who carried an Adams through the war and into the parole lines at Appomattox carried a preview of where handgun design was headed, though none of them could have known it. The double-action mechanism that made the Adams unusual in 1865 would become the standard decades later on nearly every revolver made. A Confederate riding home with one carried the future in his coat pocket, tucked in among the more familiar single-action Colts that would remain the common man's gun for a generation still to come. Number 17. The Tranter revolver. Charleston and Wilmington were the last open doors of the Confederacy, and through them, past the blockade, came another English gun most collectors still cannot name, the Tranter. A percussion revolver, well made in the Birmingham gun trade, distinguished by a double trigger system, one trigger to cock the piece, a second, smaller one beneath it to fire, that let a practiced hand work the gun with unusual speed and control. It never reached the Confederacy in Enfield numbers. It came in privately, in officers' luggage, and blockade runners' manifests, bought by men with the money and the connections to order directly from England rather than wait on whatever the Ordnance Bureau could scrape together. A Tranter on a Confederate belt was a small declaration of means, and it points to something larger than any single gun on this list. A great many of the finest weapons the Confederacy fielded were never made in the Confederacy at all, not forged in Georgia or Virginia, but shipped from Birmingham and London through a blockade that grew tighter every year of the war, paid for in cotton and credit, and the last reserves of a government running out of both. Officers who carried the Tranter home carried a piece of England's gun trade into the ruined South. A foreign-made revolver that had outlasted the war it was bought for. Proof that the Confederacy's finest guns had often traveled further to get there than any rifle made at home. Number 16. The Morse carbine. Nearly everything else on this list was built to catch up with existing technology. The Morse carbine was built ahead of it. Designed by George Morse of South Carolina before the war, it was among the first firearms anywhere in the world to fire a self-contained, center-fire metallic cartridge, brass case, primer, powder, and bullet in one waterproof unit, a design the rest of the world would not standardize for another 2 decades. The South Carolina State Armory built it, a breech-loading carbine that let a cavalryman load from horseback without a ramrod, without loose powder spilling in the wind, without the fumbling that cost a mounted man his life, in the seconds it took a muzzle loader to reload. Only around 1,000 were made. The machinery and the material to make more simply were not there. A trooper who carried one through the war's cavalry actions in the Carolinas carried a gun that belonged by rights to a later century. And a trooper who carried one home in the spring of 1865 carried something stranger still, a glimpse of the industrial future, built by a government running out of iron, out of powder, out of time. The Morse never won a battle for anyone. It arrived in numbers too small to matter, but it survived. In the hands of the few who owned it, Southern ingenuity having reached, for one brief moment, past what Southern industry could ever produce at scale. Number 15. The Tarpley carbine. In the spring of 1863, a gunsmith named Jeremiah Tarpley, working out of Greensboro, North Carolina, patented a breech-loading carbine built to solve a single problem. A man on a moving horse cannot easily ram a ball down a muzzle-loading barrel. The Tarpley broke open at the breech on a hinge, so a trooper could drop in a paper cartridge, snap it shut, and fire again without ever leaving the saddle. It was chambered at .52 caliber, built mostly of iron and brass, because iron alone was already scarce in the Confederacy by then, and it never reached production numbers much past a few hundred. Cavalrymen wanted this gun more than almost any other Southern-made weapon of the war, not for its accuracy, which was ordinary, but for its speed. A muzzle loader on horseback was a liability. A breech loader was survival. But the Tarpley's brass components were soft, its hinge wore loose under hard campaigning, and the design that made it fast also made it fragile. Few survived 4 years of Virginia and Carolina cavalry service intact. The men who carried a working Tarpley home in 1865 were carrying something rarer than most of the pistols on this list, a Southern attempt at a modern weapon, built in a small North Carolina shop with the tools the Confederacy had left. It went home to the Piedmont, to farms already burned or nearly so, and it stayed there. Not many did. Number 14, the Cook and Brother carbine. Ferdinand and Francis Cook were Englishmen who had set up a rifle works in New Orleans in 1861, building Enfield pattern arms for a government that needed rifles faster than any single shop could supply them. When New Orleans fell to Union forces in April of 1862, the Cook brothers did not stop. They moved the entire operation, machinery, workers, and all to Athens, Georgia, and kept building. What came out of that Georgia factory was, by the judgment of collectors and historians alike, some of the finest small arms work the Confederacy produced. Each carbine carried a distinctive stamp, a Confederate flag pressed into the metal alongside the words Athens, Georgia. It was not a rifle trying to look Confederate. It was a rifle built by men who had chosen a side and marked their work accordingly. Cavalrymen across the Deep South carried the short carbine version of the Cook and Brother rifle, and it kept functioning long after cheaper Southern arms had failed. Loose screws, cracked stocks, burst barrels were the ordinary fate of wartime gun-making, and the Cook shop's reputation for quality was earned against that backdrop. When the surrender came, a trooper who had carried one through Georgia or Alabama had reason to keep it working, and reason to bring it home, rather than abandon it on a battlefield. It was, by any measure, a gun worth the trouble of carrying. Number 13, the Reed and Watson Confederate carbine. In Danville, Virginia, a small firm named Reed and Watson took on a task that had nothing to do with elegant design and everything to do with arithmetic. The Confederacy did not have enough rifles. It did have older military muskets, damaged ones, obsolete ones, weapons pulled from state arsenals and battlefield salvage that were too long, too heavy, or too worn to serve as issued. Reed and Watson cut them down, rebuilt the actions, and turned them into short, muzzle-loading carbines for Virginia's mounted troops. There was no pretense of originality here. This was a weapon born entirely of shortage, assembled from whatever barrels and locks could be found and reworked into something a cavalryman could carry on a saddle instead of a rifle rack. It armed men when nothing better could be had, which in the Confederacy of 1863 and 1864 was most of the time. Few of these carbines survive today, and fewer still in complete, identifiable condition, because they were never uniform to begin with. Each one bore the particular history of whatever older weapon had been cut down to make it. A Virginia trooper who rode home in the spring of 1865 with a Reed and Watson carbine across his saddle was carrying a physical record of Confederate improvisation at its most literal, not a factory's finished product, but a rebuilt survivor of a war that had run out of new things to give its soldiers. Number 12, the double-barreled shotgun. Now the surprise most people miss. Not the Lamat with its second barrel of buckshot slung beneath a cylinder of 9 rounds. Not the Whitworth, still 4 numbers away. The most common weapon carried by Confederate cavalry in the first years of the war was not a factory-made carbine or an imported revolver at all. It was the double-barreled shotgun that had been standing behind a farmhouse door the week the man rode off to enlist. Nathan Bedford Forrest's troopers carried them. Joseph Wheeler's troopers carried them, sawed down at the muzzle, loaded with buck and ball, a combination of buckshot and a single round ball in each barrel. And at the range of a mounted charge, a load like that did more damage in a single volley than a revolver could manage in 6. The shotgun was not romantic. It did not photograph well next to a Colt or an English import. It was simply the gun a farmer already owned, and in the chaos of a cavalry engagement at close range, it worked better than almost anything the Ordnance Bureau could issue. Because the shotgun was personal property, never government issue, it never appeared on a surrender inventory. When the parole was signed, a trooper simply rode home with the same shotgun he had ridden out with, and it went back to exactly the life it had led before the war. Hanging on 2 nails over a door, brought down to shoot birds, to guard a barn, to feed a family that had nothing else. More Confederate cavalrymen carried a shotgun home than any carbine built in any Confederate factory. The gun that won no battle by itself won more of them, quietly, than any weapon on this list. Number 11, the captured Springfield model, 1861. The Springfield rifle musket was not a Confederate weapon at all. It was the standard infantry arm of the United States Army, a .58 caliber percussion rifle manufactured in Massachusetts by the tens of thousands. And for most of the war, it armed both sides in roughly equal measure. Not because the South built its own copies in any comparable number, but because Confederate soldiers picked Springfields up off the ground. They came from Bull Run, from the peninsula, from Chancellorsville, from every field where a Union line broke or a Union dead man lay unclaimed, long enough for a Confederate quartermaster to reach him first. Battlefield capture became, in a very real sense, the Confederacy's largest single source of rifles. The South's own armories at Richmond and Fayetteville never closed the gap between what its armies needed and what its factories could produce. The North's rifles filled it instead. A Confederate soldier who carried a Springfield home in 1865 was carrying, without irony, the enemy's own gun. Taken on a battlefield, carried through a war, and hidden in a wagon bed, or rolled into a blanket for the walk home rather than surrendered with the rest. Countless Springfields made that trip out of Virginia and Georgia and the Carolinas into farmhouses that would keep them over the mantle for 100 years. A captured Northern rifle turned into a Southern family's most durable possession. Number 10, the Mississippi Rifle, Model 1841. Before it was a Confederate weapon, it was a campaign promise. The .54 caliber percussion rifle traced its fame to Jefferson Davis, a West Point-trained colonel who armed his first Mississippi rifles with it in the Mexican War, then rode the reputation of Buena Vista all the way to the Confederate presidency. That was 1847. By 1861, the rifle was already old news in ordnance terms, but it was not old news in Southern memory. State arsenals across the Deep South still held thousands of them, stacked since the Mexican War and mostly untouched. When secession came, governors emptied those racks first. Georgia issued them. Alabama issued them. Mississippi, naturally, issued more of them than anywhere else. The rifle was accurate at ranges most smoothbores could not touch, and it carried in a state that had not existed as a battlefield romance yet, the specific glow of having belonged to the man now leading the Confederacy. It went to First Manassas on Mississippi's shoulders. It went to Shiloh. Men who survived 4 years with the same lock and stock carried it home in 1865 the way they had carried it out. A personal weapon, never property of the Confederate government to begin with, so no one at Appomattox had any claim to take it from them. It hung over mantles in Jackson and Vicksburg for a century afterward, the gun that had belonged to a president before he was a president, and to a soldier before he was a veteran. Number 9, the Fayetteville rifle. The machines came before the gun did. In the spring of 1861, Virginia militia seized the United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry before Union troops could destroy it, and the rifle-making machinery inside, the same machinery that had produced Springfield rifles for the federal government, was loaded onto rail cars and shipped south. Some of it went to Richmond. Some of it went to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the Confederacy built an armory around it. What came out the other end was a .58 caliber rifle that looked, at a glance, like the United States rifle it was copied from, because it was built on the exact tooling that had made the original. The earliest Fayetteville rifles even carried a United States eagle stamped into the lock plate, the die not yet replaced, with the letters CSA struck in below it. A captured federal insignia, doing double duty for the government that had captured it. Later production replaced the eagle with a Confederate flag, but the irony of the early guns was never lost on the men who carried them. North Carolina troops received the bulk of Fayetteville production, and North Carolina troops carried the bulk of it home. Of all the small arms the Confederacy built entirely within its own borders, the Fayetteville is among the most recognizable today. A rifle born from a raid, finished on stolen machines, and carried home by men whose state had supplied more soldiers to Lee's army than any other. Number 8. The Rigdon, Ansley and Company revolver. By 1864, Confederate revolver manufacturing in Georgia had already gone through one failure. The firm of Leech and Rigdon had dissolved, its machinery and its contracts passing to a new partnership in Augusta, Charles Rigdon again, this time alongside Jack Ansley. Out of that reorganization came a .36 caliber copy of the Colt Navy with one distinguishing detail, a 12-stop cylinder notched twice as often as the original Colt, an improvement almost no other Confederate maker bothered to attempt. Roughly 1,900 were built before the war ended, and by Confederate standards the finish was exceptional. Tight tolerances, clean machining, the kind of workmanship that suggested a factory that had learned from its predecessors' mistakes. Augusta itself was safer than most Confederate manufacturing towns, tucked away from Sherman's line of march, which is one reason the Rigdon and Ansley operation survived as long as it did. Officers who carried the revolver kept it under Grant's terms at the surrender, since a sidearm was private property, regardless of who had approved its manufacture. It rode home on Georgia hips and disappeared into family collections for generations. Today, a genuine Rigdon and Ansley is treated by collectors the way the Augusta workshop treated its own output, as the standard the rest of Confederate revolver making was trying, and mostly failing, to reach. Number 7. The Whitworth rifle. Here is the one that should not have been possible. Most rifles of the Civil War were bored with ordinary grooves, cut to spin a round or conical bullet down a few hundred yards of reasonably predictable flight. The Whitworth had no grooves at all. Its bore was hexagonal, machined by the British engineer Joseph Whitworth to fire a bullet cast to match. Hexagonal itself, twisting through a barrel so precisely rifled that the accuracy exceeded anything the American armies had fielded. In the hands of a trained man, it could kill at 800 yards. It could kill under the right conditions at 1,000. Fewer than 200 ever reached the Confederacy, run through the blockade at enormous cost, and issued only to hand-picked marksmen organized into units the Army called Whitworth sharpshooters. These were not line infantry. They were specialists, trusted with a rifle that cost more than $1,000 in gold when purchased in England, a sum no ordinary soldier would ever see in a lifetime of Confederate pay. At Spotsylvania Courthouse in May of 1864, a Union officer chided his men for ducking incoming fire, remarking that the Confederates could not hit an elephant at that distance. Moments later, a Whitworth bullet killed Major General John Sedgwick, the highest-ranking Union officer killed in the entire war. The rifle that did it was never recovered. The handful of Whitworths that survived 4 years of war and made it home became the deadliest heirlooms in North America. One sold at auction in recent years for $161,000. Number 6, the Richmond rifle musket. The same Harper's Ferry machinery that built the Fayetteville rifle also built this one, and it built more of it than any other Confederate arms-making operation produced of anything. Moved to Richmond in the first weeks of the war, and installed in the old state armory on the James River. The equipment turned out a .58 caliber rifle musket, recognizable at a glance by its humpback lock. A raised, curved profile, left over from the Harper's Ferry pattern that no other Confederate rifle quite matched. Tens of thousands were made across 4 years of war, more than any other long arm the South manufactured for itself, and the Richmond became the default weapon of the Army of Northern Virginia. Not the imported Enfield, not the captured Springfield, but the rifle the Confederacy built with its own captured tools, in its own capital, for its own men. It went through the wilderness. It went through Spotsylvania. It went through the trenches at Petersburg. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox, thousands of Richmond rifle muskets were among the arms stacked under Grant's terms, but thousands more were not stacked at all. Paroled men slipped them into wagons, buried them in bedrolls, walked them past provost guards who had stopped counting. The Richmond became the archetypal rifle of the common, Confederate soldier, unglamorous, unrecorded in any collector's premium, simply everywhere, the way the war itself had been. Number 5, the Griswold and Gunnison revolver. Here is the surprise of Southern manufacturing. By 1862, the Confederacy had rifles, it had cannon, it had uniforms cut from whatever cloth could be dyed butternut. What it did not have was steel. Not enough of it. Not for handguns that would never fire a battle-winning shot, but that every officer and cavalryman still wanted on his hip. Samuel Griswold, a Connecticut-born machinist who had moved south decades before the war and built a fortune on cotton gins, solved the problem by refusing to solve it the northern way. He built his revolvers with frames of brass. At a plant he raised at Griswoldville, Georgia, Griswold and his partner, Arvin Gunnison, turned out a .36 caliber copy of the Colt Navy with a frame cast from the yellow metal, not because brass was better than iron, but because brass was what a blockaded nation still had lying around in bells and fittings and scrap. Around 3,700 left the plant before the war ended, more than any other Confederate handgun maker managed. The factory itself did not survive to see the surrender. Sherman's troops burned it to the ground in November of 1864 on their march to the sea. Griswold and Gunnison, together with Leech and Rigdon and Spiller and Burr, produced roughly 70% of every revolver the Confederacy ever built. A paroled cavalryman from Georgia or Alabama who rode home with one of these brass-framed guns in his coat was carrying, in his own hands, the entire improvised arms industry of the Confederate South, the shortage and the ingenuity, cast together in a single object that had outlasted the plant that made it. Number 4, the Enfield pattern 1853 rifle musket. Not every gun a Confederate carried home was Southern made, or Southern in any sense at all. The rifle that armed more Confederate infantrymen than any other came from Birmingham and London, a .577 caliber rifle musket manufactured for the British government and sold, through intermediaries and blockade runners, to a nation that had no rifle works of its own capable of matching its quality. Several 100,000 Enfields are estimated to have reached Southern armies by the time the war ended, run through the Union blockade at Charleston and Wilmington by captains who were paid in cotton and risked their ships on every crossing. The Enfield was accurate at ranges the average Confederate rifle could not touch. It was well-balanced, well-finished, and it held up under 4 years of marching in mud in a way that cheaper Southern-made rifles often did not. For the infantryman in the ranks, not the cavalry officer, not the sharpshooter, the Enfield was frequently the best weapon he would ever hold in his life. When Lee's army came apart at Appomattox, thousands of these rifles went home in wagons and hidden under bedrolls, rather than onto the stacked arms pile the surrender terms required. More Confederate foot soldiers carried an Enfield back to a ruined farm than any other long arm the war produced, a British gun built for a British army that became the signature rifle of the common Southern soldier. Number 3, the Leech and Rigdon revolver. Few Confederate handguns carry the reputation of the Leech and Rigdon. Thomas Leech and Charles Rigdon began building their .36 caliber copy of the Colt Navy in Memphis in 1861, in a partnership formed the way so many Confederate arms firms were formed, quickly, under pressure, with machinery scavenged wherever it could be found. Memphis fell to Union forces in June of 1862, and the firm did what half of Confederate industry did in those years. It moved. Leech and Rigdon relocated their operation to Greensboro, Georgia, and kept building revolvers as Union armies pressed closer from every direction. The company produced roughly 1,500 handguns before it finally dissolved. A small number set against the war's demand, but a number achieved without a single settled factory to call its own for most of its existence. Officers who owned a Leech and Rigdon kept it under Grant's surrender terms and rode home with it on their belts, one more private sidearm that never touched a stacked arms pile. Today, an authentic Leech and Rigdon is among the most coveted handguns in Confederate collecting, not simply for its rarity, but for what it represents, a factory that outran 2 Union armies just to keep producing a revolver, one at a time, until there was nowhere left to run. Number 2, the Colt 1860 Army Revolver. The most powerful sidearm any Confederate soldier carried was, like so much of the Confederacy's best equipment, built in the North. The Colt 1860 Army was a .44 caliber, 6-shot revolver manufactured in Hartford, Connecticut, purchased by Southern officers before the war closed the border, or taken off the bodies of Union dead on battlefields where the fighting had been close enough to loot. It hit harder than the smaller Navy models. It carried farther. Cavalry commanders and staff officers favored it for exactly that reason, the same reason any soldier favors the larger caliber when he can get one. Under the terms Grant dictated at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, an officer's sidearm belonged to the officer, not to the surrender. So a Colt Army bought in New Orleans in 1861, or stripped from a dead Union cavalryman at Brandy Station, rode home on a Confederate hip regardless of where it had been built or how it had been acquired. It became, in thousands of Southern households, a family treasure passed down for generations, a Northern-made gun carried by a Southern officer that outlived the cause it had been used to defend. Number 1, the Colt 1851 Navy Revolver. Number 1 hung above more Southern fireplaces than any other gun ever made. The Colt Navy was not the most powerful revolver a Confederate soldier could own, nor the rarest, nor the most technically advanced. It was a .36 caliber, 6-shot revolver, light enough to wear from dawn to dark without complaint, simple enough to strip and clean by firelight, and accurate enough that a man trusted his life to it without a second thought. That combination, not superiority in any single measure, is what made it the sidearm of the entire Confederacy. J.E.B. Stuart carried the Navy. John Mosby carried the Navy. Officers across every theater of the war, from the Shenandoah Valley to the defenses of Petersburg, chose it over heavier and more expensive alternatives for the same reason a man chooses the boots that fit rather than the boots that impress. It was the gun that was already on a Confederate officer's hip in April of 1865, and under the terms Grant dictated at Appomattox Courthouse, it stayed there. An officer kept his sidearm. He did not surrender it, did not stack it, did not hand it to a Union quartermaster. He rode home wearing it. Most Colt Navy revolvers were manufactured in Hartford, Connecticut, the same state that had spent 4 years arming the Army, sent to kill the men who now carried its revolvers home. That is the fact this list has been building toward. A Northern factory in a Northern city, on a river that had never seen a Confederate soldier, produced the single most personal possession of the defeated Southern fighting man. Not the rifle he was issued, not the uniform he wore, the revolver he had bought or been given or taken and had chosen above every other weapon available to him to keep on his own body until the war ended. It went home in a coat pocket or a saddle holster, to a farm that might not have a roof left, to a family that might not have flour in the kitchen, and there, over the mantel, in 10,000 Southern houses, it stayed, not as a weapon anymore, but as the last thing a man had carried through a war that had taken everything else. The surrender ground at Appomattox is quiet now, a stretch of Virginia grass and split-rail fence where an army dissolved in an afternoon. But the guns did not dissolve with it. They went home in wagons, in bedrolls, on belts that Grant's terms had left untouched, and they outlived nearly every man who carried them. Some of what went home surprised even the men who owned it. A double-barreled shotgun that had never left the farm, a hexagonal English rifle that could kill at 1,000 yards in an age when most soldiers could not hit a barn at 200, a revolver with a brass frame cast from scrap because the steel had run out 3 years before the surrender did. If one of these 25 surprised you more than the rest, it is worth saying so in the comments. Someone else's great-great-grandfather may have carried the same gun home. Somewhere in the rural South tonight, in a farmhouse that has changed hands 4 or 5 times since 1865, one of these revolvers still hangs over a fireplace that has been rebuilt at least once. The bluing is long gone from the barrel. The brass has gone the color of old honey, and the light from the fire below it moves the same way it moved the night the man who carried it home finally set it down.